Andrew Jackson, we thank you for your service. Andrew Jackson. Andrew Jackson. Andrew Jackson was the people's president.
Even though they were elected 188 years apart. For some insight on the parallels between the two presidents, we're joined by John Meacham, who won the Pulitzer Prize for his biography of Andrew Jackson, American Lion. Welcome, John. The president really is fond of President Jackson. Where do you how do you look at the parallels between the two?
Well, you know, presidents look back for inspiration, but more often for sanction. They want to be able to say that this is a verse in a hymn that's been sung before. And so what I think President Trump, as the most unconventional president in our history, which I think he would embrace, is looking for is some historical parallel that I think grounds him to some extent in the experience of the country.
Upon being elected in 1828, Jackson replaced 10% of the federal workforce with appointed loyalists and began an ultimately successful campaign to eliminate the National Bank, which he viewed as a tool of Eastern financial elites. Jackson is most remembered for his role in expanding America's frontier. Having captured the territory of Florida during his military career, President Jackson pursued policies like the Indian Removal Act, which resettled nearly all Native Americans from the eastern half of the United States, killing thousands in the process.
President Trump is, in some ways, I think, quite correct to claim Jackson's mantle. Jackson came to office insisting that Indian removal should be the first agenda of the federal government. So kicking people out of the country, not worrying too much about their rights, and he also claimed to be sweeping out all this corruption that existed in Washington, and he claimed to be an outsider, even though he was a very wealthy man who clearly came from and represented quite specific economic interests. So it's not an accident that Trump and Trump's handlers see a commonality with President Jackson.
I wonder why they keep talking about Trump and Jackson, Jackson and Trump. Oh, I know the feeling, Andrew. I'm a big Andrew Jackson fan.
You know, Andrew Jackson is the one president who has been most often compared to being Trump-like, or shall I say Andrew Jackson-like, in that he was a controversial figure, one who had been, if you heard it back in those days, robbed by the establishment, comes storming back, and was not exactly everyone's cup of tea. Does that analogy hold? Did Andrew Jackson ever change once he got in?
Andrew Jackson was a very rough and tumble frontiersman, and he remained that way to his whole life. He killed a man in a duel. He was an Indian fighter. He was shot by future Senator Thomas Hart Benton and barely survived. When he got in the White House, South Carolina was threatening to not pay their taxes on imports, the tariff. And when Jackson heard that, he threatened to send troops in and was even talking about hanging someone for treason. So Jackson followed that through into his presidency.
And you know, Andrew Jackson was a military hero and genius and a beloved president. We had the greatest election. In all fairness, I used to hear Andrew Jackson. This was now greater than the election of Andrew Jackson. People say that. No, people say it. I'm not saying it. Right? This was the equivalent or greater. They say Andrew Jackson was always the nastiest campaign. They actually said we topped it.
On this, when President Trump has compared himself to President Jackson, and sanction is the perfect way to frame it, he has connected himself with the upset that Jackson created with elites. He is right about that. I mean, in terms of shaking the window panes in Washington.
But to paraphrase Hamlet, context is all. The first 6 presidents of the United States were either Virginia planters or Adamses from Massachusetts. And so Jackson comes from the lowest rungs of white society. He opens up democratic possibilities, lowercase d, for white people, white men of his type. But he had been a lawyer, a prosecutor, a judge, a senator, briefly the governor of Florida. Rachel hated the mosquitoes, so he moved back to Tennessee. He had run for president in 1824. He had accepted the result, though he had won the popular vote. He did not win the plurality, the electoral vote. And then he ran in 1828. So he was an experienced, and he was a general, obviously. So he was an experienced figure. He wanted to shake up things. He believed that was his platform. He believed that he was and he was the first president to put it this way, that he was the only directly elected representative of all the American people. And so all this does begin to sound, as Mark Twain once said, or reputed to have said, that history may not repeat itself, but it does rhyme. But he had an experience. He had governmental experience. He understood that.
That did not stop a man named General Andrew Jackson of Tennessee. Do you ever hear of Andrew Jackson of Tennessee? He was a great general and a great president. And his ragtag militia of patriots who were ready to fight to defend American independence.
And I really think what's critical in my mind is, and we haven't seen this with President Trump yet, is does he understand how to use his own weaknesses? Can he make his vices virtues? Jackson knew that the world thought he was a crazy man. So once a delegation came to the White House during the bank crisis, they wanted relief, and he starts pounding on the table and he says, "There's no money here, I'll hang you all." They all run out of the room. As the door shuts, he turns to his chief of staff and he says, "Didn't I manage them well?" He knew how to use those weaknesses to become strengths. We just haven't seen that with President Trump.
Jackson rose to glory. He did it with courage, with grit, and with patriotic heart. And by the way, he was one of our great presidents.
He was considered, in retrospect, as a president, one of our greatest. So I guess what I'm asking you is, when we make a big deal about presumed character flaws, the New York Post mentioned them, others have mentioned them, in Donald Trump, could those work in his favor, that no-nonsense Jacksonian style, if he were to become president?
Yes, it could, because Jackson was very much admired for his right-on integrity and his honesty and his forthright speech. And it's also useful to remember the whole federal budget was not only balanced, but the national debt disappeared during Jackson's presidency.
Andrew Jackson. Andrew Jackson. A man named General Andrew Jackson of Tennessee.
And what about Jackson's sense of himself? I was struck when Steve Bannon, the president's top aides, talked about Jackson. If you look at Jackson's inaugural address, Bannon did this around the inaugural address,
right.
Jackson fit himself in the constraints of the office. I mean, he recognized limitations, that restraint you were talking about.
He was a Jeffersonian, he wanted to be a Jeffersonian Republican. The key thing about Jackson is, look, he was complicit in two of the great original sins in American life: African-American slavery, Native American removal. But on both those issues, we can't put the whole weight of that on Jackson because they were the nation's sins. And he may have been on the extreme edge of the mainstream, but he was still within the mainstream. To me, the great lesson of Jackson is that he believed in the Union. He believed his mother and his brothers had died during the Revolution. He'd been a prisoner of war as a young teenager during the Revolution. He really believed that his family's blood in many ways had sanctified the Union, had made it sacred. And he referred to us as one great family. He believed that we would have to fight. Democracy was like that. The point of democracy was to disagree, right. But it was to be within one family. And to that end, I believe he had a broader vision of American unity than President Trump has demonstrated yet. One hopes that President Trump, in studying and looking at this, he will do so, and not just take the parts of Jackson that are convenient to him, which is the kind who didn't like the press, although that doesn't separate him from many presidents, does it?
Exactly.
And the tough guy. Jackson was a tough guy, but he was tough in the service of, in a very shrewd and strategic way most of the time. We have not yet seen whether this president can be shrewd and strategic.
Jackson's life was devoted to one of very crucial principle. He understood that real leadership means putting America first. But that...
We have about 20 seconds left. What advice would Jackson give this president in terms of if he were to come back through the mists?
Fire the second shot. Don't pick so many fights. Pick ones you think you can win, and lead the whole country, because you become greater the more people you attract. Don't just lead your base, because that base is already with you. Expand it. Lead the country. Lead that great family.
All right, John Meacham, thanks for taking us back to the 18th century and tying it to today. We really appreciate it. And stay with us. We'll be back in a moment.